In Chapter 4, we are going to focus on how living things get energy. So, energy is the ability to do work. And energy is needed to do all your life processes, all the chemical reactions that take place in your cells, from breathing to digesting to thinking. All of this requires energy. It's basically needed to break down and build up molecules, and it also helps transport molecules across the plasma membrane. Some energy gets lost to the environment as heat. Life depends on the constant use of energy. Since energy cannot be recycled, life depends on the flow of energy. It goes from the energy from the sunlight, it changes forms. This is during photosynthesis. We use it for work, and then some gets lost as heat in the environment. So organisms are required to have a constant input of energy. That's why us humans, we need to constantly eat. So how organisms get energy? There are two types of organisms, either autotrophs or heterotrophs. And so both of them require food, which is any type of organic molecule, such as glucose, that organisms use for chemical energy. An autotroph is an organism that can make its own food, and most will use photosynthesis to do this. So photosynthesis is a process of using energy in sunlight in order to make food. It will be used primarily by plants and algae, and it will also be used by some bacteria. This is fairly rare though. Producers then are organisms that produce food for itself and then for other organisms. These form the basis or the bottom of the food chain. And so we can see that here, that our producers are the bottom of the food chain. The grass is the example of the producer here. The grass feeds the grasshopper, which in turn feeds the frog feeds the snake then feeds the hawk, and then the fungus are responsible for breaking down and decomposing. So heterotrophs are organisms that get their food by consuming other organisms. This includes all animals, fungus, and single-celled organisms. So consumers are organisms that consume other organisms for food, and they may consume autotrophs. Remember, that's another way of saying producers. Or they can eat other consumers. So energy molecules, there are two main energy molecules that our bodies use. The first one is glucose, and the second one is ATP. So glucose is a simple carbohydrate, has a chemical formula of C6H12O6. So 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms. And this is the nearly universal food for life. This stores chemical energy, and it's a form of energy that is carried by your blood. And then it gets taken up by trillions of your cells, and it is the end product of photosynthesis. So glucose is found in almost all living things. ATP is our second energy molecule, and it stands for adenosine. That's where we get our A from. Triphosphate. And so this tri tells us that there are 3 phosphate groups on ATP. So ATP is the energy carrying molecule that cells use to power their metabolic processes. This is made during the first half of photosynthesis, and then it gets used to power the second half of photosynthesis, and the second half is where we make glucose. This is used for energy to power most other cellular processes. And so how ATP releases energy is when one of its three, it releases energy when one of its three phosphate groups is released. That makes it become ADP, where now the D stands for diphosphate. Because di stands for 2. So we pretty much go from ATP to ADP plus a free phosphate group. So organisms need both glucose and ATP in order to survive. Because one molecule of glucose contains more chemical energy in a single smaller package than ATP. So glucose is a very powerful and very small molecule, whereas ATP is a more stable form of energy than glucose. So glucose is better for storing and transporting energy. This is maybe like a long-term storage. It's too powerful for the cell to use efficiently, whereas ATP contains the right amount of energy to power all the life processes within a cell. So we have to take glucose and pretty much break it down into ATP in order for our cells to be able to use the energy in glucose. So making and using food, the flow of energy begins with photosynthesis. This stores energy from the sun in the chemical bonds of glucose. The breaking of chemical bonds in glucoses releases energy in order to make ATP. That process is called cellular respiration, in which cells break down glucose and makes ATP for energy. So this works hand in hand with photosynthesis. And so we can see that in the diagram. Photosynthesis here happens in the chloroplasts, whereas cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria. However, they both go hand in hand. This shows you what goes into photosynthesis right here. The arrows are pointing in. So water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide go into photosynthesis. Out of photosynthesis, we get oxygen and glucose. But if you look, those are the two things that go into cellular respiration. And then that CO2 comes out of cellular respiration. So these two processes really need to be talked about together. So photosynthesis is the single most important process on Earth. Without photosynthesis, there would be no oxygen in the atmosphere. And so your chemical equation for photosynthesis is 6 CO2, or we take in 6 carbon dioxide, and 6 water molecules, and some light. And in return, we get 1 molecule of glucose and 6 oxygen molecules. So your reactants are everything on the left-hand side of that arrow. So that includes the carbon dioxide, the water, and the light. Our products are on the right-hand side of that arrow. And so that would be the glucose and the oxygen. In plants, glucose is often stored as a starch. And then that oxygen is a waste product and released into the atmosphere. Cellular respiration burns glucose for energy. This releases energy in glucose, and it does so slowly because remember, glucose is a very powerful molecule, lots of energy in it. So we have to release that energy very slowly and very controlled. And it's controlled by the many small steps. And our end product here is ATP. Your chemical equation for cellular respiration takes one molecule of glucose and your 6 molecules of oxygen, and in return we get 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and we get some ATP, some chemical energy. So remember, the reactants are on the left side of the arrow, so that gives us our glucose as a reactant and our 6 oxygen molecules as another reactant. Our products then are on the right hand side again, which gives us our 6 carbon dioxide as a product, our 6 water molecules, and our ATP molecules as products. The carbon dioxide and the water are released as waste products. Very important, cellular respiration occurs in all living things, whereas photosynthesis only occurs in producers or autotrophs. So this is a quick overview of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Over the course of this chapter, we're going to be looking at each of these processes in much more detail.